Well, hello again from here at Newcastle United's training ground, where the good news is Callum Wilson has trained this week. Eddie Howe's just told us there over my shoulder he's looking very good, he's looking fit, he should be in the squad down at Crystal Palace tomorrow. But is this Callum's last hurrah as a Newcastle United player, the final 6 games of this season? I think it might just be, and this is why. Wilson has 12 months to run on his contract beyond this summer. There is a resale value there to an extent, and in an FFP world, I think it makes too much sense now for the club not to cash in on Wilson this summer. Why do I say that? Well, it comes back to a quote Anthony Gordon gave me in an interview here at the training ground a few weeks ago, and it's one which has stayed with me and I've repeated many times since. It is that availability is the best ability, and Callum Wilson just does not play enough games. Listen, we can park the debate about Callum Wilson, the player. We'll revisit that in a second. You know, I think he's wonderful. You all guys probably agree. But 8 starts this season out of 32. That means 1/4 of matches he's been there to start. You know, you just cannot carry a player, and I use carry with a heavy heart. But you know, when squad places are limited, in an FFP world, I use that phrase again, where you've got to extract as much value from every asset you have. Is it really good enough? Is it really acceptable to have a player who does miss as much football as Callum does? Now, this has taken nothing away from him as an individual, and honestly, I think if he comes back in now for the last 6 games and scores goals, improves his worth, and we've heard today that the Euro squads are going to go from 23 to 26 men. If there's one injury to the likes of Kane, Watkins or Ivan Toney, then Callum Wilson perhaps could put himself right in the frame for going to the Euros this summer. That is the level of ability when he's fit, when he's in form. He is top class, there's absolutely no doubt about that. You've only got to look at his numbers. But I just think now, heading into the final year of his contract, if Newcastle can get some, and then by the way, you know, the 20 million Newcastle played for Wilson 5 years ago, whatever it was, that is all off the books now. So any sale they've got on him, that would be classed as pure profit from an accounting point of view. If they can get somewhere close to 10-12 million pound for him, then you know, I think we'd expect to see Callum Wilson move on this summer. Eddie Howe was asked about that, and he gave away in many ways the conversations of this nature have taken place, because he presented the argument he is given to the club's owners, and his was, and it does make sense. If you are going to sell a player like Callum Wilson, how much would it cost to bring in a replacement? And he said, you know, that's very difficult, and of course it is. You know, if you sell Callum Wilson for £10 million, you're not getting a Callum Wilson replacement for £10 million. But it comes back to, if the player you bring in is younger, isn't as proven as Callum, but plays and is available and is someone you can develop, you know, I just think everything now is pointing towards a big change in that position this summer. Everything will be built around Alexander Isak. We've seen his worth, you know, his elite level in recent weeks. He is the number one. He is the starter. If Wilson was a player who was fit every week and was happy to play, you know, in that rotation with Isak, then wonderful. We saw, didn't we, during the final 6 months of last season, how well it worked, the two of them in tandem. They almost helped each other in that, you know, I've always said, you know, Isak's a better player when Wilson's fit, and Wilson's a better player when Isak is fit, because they allow both players, you know, I think, need that little period of rest in between games. It worked perfectly. But I just think now it's too big of a gamble with Callum Wilson to go forward into next season, especially when there's an opportunity to make a little bit of money on him this summer. Now, who would the suitors be? We reported in January there was a loan inquiry from Atletico Madrid that the club rebuffed. There was a little bit of interest from AC Milan there as well. I've heard a lot of noises around Saudi Arabia too. So yeah, to finish this opening segment, is this Callum Wilson's last hurrah as a Newcastle player? I really think it will be. Now, while Wilson is fit, there was some other big fitness news this morning from Eddie, and that was he confirmed both Mail Sports stories that we've broken during the course of the past week. Joe Willock and Louis Miley won't feature again this season. Willock, as we reported, there's decisions being taken to allow him a period of rest / strengthening of the area around the Achilles. Now, Eddie used the phrase a longer term view had been taken with both players, and I get that, I understand that. Willock has had the troublesome Achilles problem. It makes too much sense now, you know, just to allow him to have that period between now and coming back in pre-season. He clearly wasn't the same player. He was clearly affected by the injury. You know, it was no good carrying on with Joe Willock, even though he is free of injury, he is okay to play. If needed, I think he could play. He could have carried on, but what we were seeing was a vastly diminished version of the player we know he is. So I think looking at that and looking at the longer term health, as Eddie said, I think the right decision has been taken on Joe for him to sit out the remainder of the campaign. And likewise Louis Miley as well, 17-year-old to come in and play 20 odd matches this season. That was never anticipated, as good as he had been, but we just saw towards the end of that run of games perhaps tailing off, and that was understandable. He then picked up the back injury away with England, and again the decision has been taken. I think Louis Miley could play this season if needed, but the longer term health, the longer term development of the player is better that the injury is sorted. That is those two. There's another quartet of players who aren't yet training but could feature this season. That is Kieran Trippier, Joe Linton, Nick Pope and Miguel Almiron. They're not yet out on the grass with the remainder of the group. But Eddie Howe hopes that all four will play at some point this season. I don't expect to see any of them at Crystal Palace tomorrow. Now, the question I asked of Eddie this morning, since we last spoke to you guys on this channel, and Eddie against Tottenham, was that the fifth Champions League place, as likely as that may have been, when you saw Newcastle v Tottenham 10 days ago, you thought, why can't Newcastle close that 10-point gap and take the fifth place? Well, the fifth place now is gone because of the coefficient in terms of Champions League, and they're not going to make up 16 points on Aston Villa. So there won't be Champions League football next season. And the question I said to Eddie was, you can probably afford 1 year out of the Champions League, but can you afford 2 if you're going to keep the likes of Bruno, Isak and Anthony Gordon at the club, elite Champions League level players? That's, what I've called them in copy and on video in recent weeks. I really think that trio now are striding ahead in terms of their ability and their worth. Now, Eddie said he didn't want to look that far ahead in the future, and he gave a diplomatic answer in that, all the club has got to do is continue to make strides forward, to continue to dream, to continue to be ambitious. And I get why he said that. He didn't want to fall at the trap I was perhaps setting, whereby he said, yes, if we don't get Champions League next year, Isak, Bruno and Gordon will be off. But is that the reality of the situation? I don't know. Perhaps take Anthony Gordon out of that, but he's certainly getting to that level whereby, I mentioned earlier there, the interview I gave with him, he used the phrase, he wants to be at the very top of the game. Well, the very top of the game isn't finishing 6th, 7th or 8th in the Premier League and playing Europa League or Conference League football every year. That's just a brutal reality. So no, it is the reality. I go back to that. I was right the first time. Bruno Guimaraes as well. Bruno Guimaraes has had a taste of the Champions League this year with Newcastle. He isn't a player who was happy playing in the lesser European competitions. Likewise, Alexander Isak, and if you're not in those competitions, it gives would-be suitors, and there's going to be no shortage of them with regards Isak. It gives them reason to try and convince and persuade the player that they are better off elsewhere. I think he can do one season. I really do. I've got no inkling that any of that trio are unhappy. To the contrary, I would say all three are very happy here. Why would they not be playing at St James's Park, playing in front of sold out stadiums, playing under Eddie Howe, a manager who improves players? Everything at this football club in terms of the playing side and the squad and the players' happiness and the players' development, I think it's good. I think the coach and staff, everything they've got in place there is geared up for elite players. I think they've got an elite coach and staff. But, they're not going to be in the Champions League this year. So I think it was a valid question. I think it's a consideration. And if Newcastle are to keep that trio and others at the club longer term, I think the priority next season has to be to get back into the Champions League, however they do that. Now, to that end, would Thursday night football be a distraction? Or, as we've seen with Aston Villa, can it generate momentum in many ways? Well, Newcastle now have got a real chance to finish the season off on a high and get back into Europe. And for me, and part of me is thinking with my passport, and selfishly as a journalist who would go on these trips, I also think as well, to not have European football would just be a little bit of a dent in terms of the momentum, the image, the sort of the feel good around the club. So I think now, between now and the end of the season, these last 6 games, it's imperative for the club to return European football. Now, how do they achieve that? I hope they continue doing what they did against Spurs 10 days ago. And the reason I say that is there was a real pragmatism to Eddie Howe's game plan. Now, Eddie Howe doesn't want to play like that, whereby they cede, 70% possession to the opposition. It was the reason he brought Sandro Tonali in the summer. He wanted to evolve. He always said that the way they played in surviving relegation and departs during, even last season, the wonderful run to the Champions League, he wanted to, I use that word, evolve into a more possession-based side whose fate, whose destiny was in their own hands in terms of having the ball, dictating play, dictating, the control, the tempo, everything else. Now, for me, for too long this season, and this might sound like a little bit of a criticism of Eddie Howe, but my wider thoughts in terms of how good he is, I thought they should have reverted to a more pragmatic style. One which was perhaps more reflective of the season they escaped relegation, and play to the strengths. And for me, right now, Newcastle's biggest strengths are the pace of Anthony Gordon, the pace of Alexander Isak, playing on the counter-attack, not trying to have the ball. I don't think they've got the players at the moment who actually have the football and to keep the football. Play at the best of your abilities, and against Tottenham we saw that, and wow, how devastating, how impactful was it. So for me, I hope they do that again and I would expect them to do that between now and the end of the season. Sit back to a degree, play on the break, don't try and dictate games, play to your strengths. Gordon, Isak, Barnes, that front three, I used it in the last video, the notorious BIG, Barnes, Isak, Gordon. If they can keep that trio fit with, Wilson coming in to aid them at times as well, I think they've got a real chance of taking, 14, 15 points out of the remaining 18, and that for me would be enough to take that 6th place, perhaps even 5th. Now, an update away from the pitch. Newcastle are entering the final phase of interviews with regards to their vacant sporting director position. Several candidates have been met several times already, but none of them have had an audience in front of the chairman, Yasser Al-Rumayyan. So we are entering the phase whereby the longer list, that's going to be whittled down to a 3-man shortlist. We don't know the exact identity of that, but we do know the likes of Mitchell, Pinto, Bravo have all been spoken to, among many others as well. So it all points towards an appointment before the summer, certainly going into the summer window. I think that is Newcastle's wish, Newcastle's desire. When that happens, we might then see an acceleration in the negotiations with Dan Ashworth to Manchester United. But until Newcastle get their end of the bargain sorted, I don't think we'll see Ashworth at Old Trafford. Well, that's it for now, guys. I'll be down at Selhurst Park tomorrow night, so do say hello if you see me in transit. I'll put the links in the description below to any Daily Mail stories which have come from this morning's press conference. And yeah, please stay logged on. I'll have my post-match reflections down at Selhurst Park, as well as the match story at Mail Plus, Mail Online as well. Okay, guys, I'll give you a quick little 360 of this place. Thank you again for watching. A little bit busy now. And yeah, I'll see you in 24 hours' time. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.